The War of the Roses was an epic, century-long conflict that pitted brother against brother, father against son, and eventually, fifth cousin once removed against fifth cousin once removed. This was all for, of course, the grand prize of the English throne. The war brought family lines to an end, had battles that would change the scope of military conflict, and ended the medieval era and whose mascots were two absolutely gorgeous flowers. This is, of course, the War of the Roses. Our story really begins in the early 1300s, which was a time characterized by famines, plagues, the 100 Years' War, and also the adorably named Little Ice Age. But in all seriousness, it was not a great time to be alive. Basically, tensions were sky high, and these tensions were only heightened by the death of the English monarch, King Edward III. Edward's eldest son had died in 1376 of, dysentery, so the throne was passed down to Edward's grandson, King Richard II, who was only 12. The only problem was that Edward had bypassed his other three surviving sons, creating some good old-fashioned family feud that would be passed down to the following generations. In 1450, Henry VI, or Henry Lancaster, succeeded his father, Henry V, and became King of England at the ripe old age of 9 months old. Thanks to his father's military conquests, Henry VI also became the disputed King of France. In 1445, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, a noble and strong-willed French woman whose ambition and political savvy overshadowed that of her husband's, who was, more into the partying side of being king. So, as expected, all was not well in King Henry's court. Henry's lack of leadership led him to lose almost all his holdings in France. This and the corruption and mismanagement of power in England, not to mention heavy taxation, caused frustrated property owners and peasants from Kent to revolt in 1450. These peasants, led by Jack Cade, marched on London and presented Henry with a list of demands known as the Complaint of the Poor Commoners of Kent. Henry never officially agreed to Cade's demands, one of which was to recall Richard, Duke of York, from Ireland back to England. Remember that King Edward III? Richard of York was his great-grandson, and so had a strong claim on the English throne. After a series of skirmishes, Henry squashed Cade's rebellion and pardoned the rebels. Except for poor old Jack Cade, who would later die from a mortal wound during his arrest. Henry also falsely believed that Richard of York was behind Cade's rebellion. This rivalry set the stage for 30 years of power battles involving 3 generations of Yorks and Lancasters. After King Henry had a mental breakdown, the popular Richard of York was established as the Lord Protector of England, basically to keep things in check while Henry was sorting himself out. Richard got down to work immediately. He set up dozens of reforms and imprisoned the king's allies. However, Henry made a miraculous mental recovery, reversed the reforms, and released his friends. Meanwhile, in the north, Richard and the powerful Earl of Warwick were raising armies, hoping to destroy the Lancastrian Henry. This would begin the War of the Roses. On May 22, 1455, the White Rose of York fought the Red Rose of Lancaster in the First Battle of St. Albans. This battle would end in a decisive York victory and the imprisonment of King Henry. His release was negotiated, but York had his title of Lord Protector returned to him. Being a poor loser, Henry had once again another mental breakdown, and when he recovered, once again proclaimed that Richard was no longer the Lord Protector. Fearing for their lives, Richard and the Earl of Warwick fled abroad. Richard taking the hiding approach, and the Earl of Warwick taking the more violent approach of defending his fortress in Calais and sporadically invading Lancastrian lands. However, in 1460, Warwick turned the heat up by straight-up invading England, taking London and Kent. The Battle of Northampton saw Warwick's men meet the Lancastrian forces and defeat them, capturing Henry once more. Richard of York then returned to England, basically after Warwick did all the hard stuff for him, and asserted his claim to the throne upon Henry's death. Henry's wife, Margaret, remember her? She was basically livid. She pled with the King of Scotland for an army, and after receiving it, she and her band of crazy Scots raised hell across the land. York and his son Edmund met their end at the wrong end of a Scottish pike in the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. Then, Henry's wife Margaret and the Scots continued to beat Warwick back, and in the second installment of the Battle of St. Albans, she rescued her husband when she found him just simply sitting under a tree. She then retreated to the north to consolidate, leaving London without a king. The late York's other son, Edward, would then be, by the people of London, established as king. He and his army would catch up to Margaret and the Lancastrians just outside of York in the Battle of Taunton on the 29th of March, 1461. The battle that commenced was a bloody revenge story that 29,000 men would perish in, leaving Edward the victor. It appeared as if Edward had finally ended the War of the Roses in a York victory, but no. In a crazy turn of events, the Earl of Warwick betrayed the new king by sailing to France in 1470, shaking hands with the exiled Margaret, and invading England with Edward's jealous brother George. Forced to flee, Edward sailed abroad with the Duke of Gloucestershire. Meanwhile, Warwick then betrayed George by placing the party-loving Henry back on the throne again. Make no mistake though, it was really Warwick and Margaret calling the shots from here. However, Edward then invaded England again in 1471 and, in a thick fog, using the weather to his advantage, surprised Warwick's men, defeating them and killing Warwick. Margaret was captured, but later exiled to France. Poor old Henry was murdered, and their child was killed. With the fall of the Lancaster line came the end of the War of the Roses. The end of the war also brought to an end the medieval era. The power shifts, for the most part, finally ceased, and England remained centralized under a new king, Henry VII. This ushered in a new age, that of the Tudors.